A lot of games over the years have made me realise things about myself. Doom made me realise I have a penchant for the wholesale slaughter of Demon Hellspawn. Wipeout 2097 made me realise that I'm a total speed freak, and EverQuest made me realise that I have a halfling fetish. Trials 2 has made me realise that I must be a masochist. My average lifespan in the game is about 4 seconds. I die over and over and over and over again, but I keep coming back for more. It has a just one more turn appeal to it that will make even Civilization shake its head in disbelief. Any other game with this degree of trial and error would be hastily uninstalled and the disc returned to its box. Then its box would be fired out of a cannon into the sun, and then the sun would be collapsed into itself for good measure. But Trials 2, even when you're wiping out about 900 times per hour, it's still crazy good fun. Trials 2 is a 2D platformer / puzzle game at heart. That may seem like a bit of a stretch since you're on a motorbike and you're driving up big ramps and doing somersaults and wheelies all over the place, but the game has all the basic principles of the 2D platformer. Rather than running and jumping as is typical in a platformer, you're applying weight to either the front or rear of your bike by leaning, you're accelerating and braking, and you're performing some complex manoeuvres that involve coordination of all of these things to traverse an extremely hostile environment. While there are no dangers in the traditional platformer sense, stuff like traps or enemies, if your motorbike guy touches any part of the environment, like for instance if your bike lands upside down after a somersault, it's a wipeout and you're back to the last checkpoint, or if you're going for a perfect run, you're back to the start of the level. Trials 2 plays a lot like a 2D platformer in this sense, so it's definitely a game for platformer fans first and foremost. The puzzle aspect comes from figuring out when to apply weight and acceleration and to what extent. While this concept may be no more complicated than a timed jump in a typical platformer, it will be a new concept both cognitively and dexterously for most players, so figuring out exactly how to navigate these environments isn't going to be as intuitive a process as running and jumping. Granted, there's a lot more doing than figuring out how to do, so the game definitely challenges your fingers a lot more than your mind, but mounting that difficulty curve takes a lot of figuring out of the game's underlying mechanics. Getting the bike to do exactly what you want it to do takes quite a bit of finesse, but like everything else, that's a learning process. There are a number of game modes, each of which has a specific objective. Standard race, where you're trying to complete the course as quickly as possible. Flip mode, where the goal is to do as many somersaults as possible, and wheelie mode, where the objective is to collect gold rings. No, really. There's also the dynamic mode, where objects in the environment, like the barrels and wooden boards, aren't static and are subject to the game's physics engine, which makes these environments even more treacherous. But whatever game mode you're playing, the all-pervading, always at the front of your mind goal is to not die. Now, that may seem like something of a redundant statement, since it's true of almost all games ever, but there's something about Trials 2 that makes not dying doubly relevant, and that's that it's really fucking hard. I've been gaming for about 20 years, and I like to consider myself a pretty good gamer, especially when it comes to 2D platformers, one of my favourite genres, but Trials 2 is just death after death after death after death. It's one of those easy to learn, difficult to master type things, so you'll be able to get through all the 50-something tracks probably in 1 or 2 sittings, which is made fairly comfortable with the generous checkpoint system, but your goal quickly shifts from finishing courses to finishing courses quickly, which means no wipeouts, which takes a lot of work. But the game manages to achieve something that few games have managed before. Even failure is fun. Never does the game descend into tedium, and never will you feel frustrated because of your failures. The game never punishes you, you'll never feel cheated. Its authentic physics mean that if you're screwing up, it's because you leaned too far forward, or because you accelerated too soon and your back tyre clipped something and sent you spinning to your doom. It's never the game's fault. And thanks to the checkpoint system, you're immediately given a chance to try again when you do screw up. As well as being fair, failure is also fun, and often funny. I mean, motorbike plus authentic physics plus crashing is pretty much a perfect formula. In addition to simply driving through the tracks, the game features online leaderboards where you can compete with others from around the world, and you can set up teams with friends, so if you're the competitive type, the game has enormous potential for replay. The game also lets you download replays and ghost recordings of any other player competing in the leaderboard, meaning you can watch or even directly compete with just about anyone, which is a great way to improve your technique as well as give the game a more competitive edge if looking at clock times isn't your idea of competition. Although the game uses fully three-dimensional environments and models, the game's side-on camera, as well as an inability to steer your bike left or right, gives the game a 2D feel. So while strictly speaking I'm wrong to keep calling it a two-dimensional game since it isn't, it plays like and mostly looks like one. There are several camera angles to choose from, many of which show off the actual 3D-ness of the game, but while these camera angles make for some pretty spectacular replays, they really aren't practical as gameplay cameras. You'll likely be playing with the side-on 2D style cam pretty much all the time. The visuals as a whole are pretty wonderful. The game's lighting and shadows are especially beautiful, and the compact nature of the environments means all that detail is crammed into a tiny area, so there's always something great looking on display. You'll often be too focused to be able to fully appreciate it, but Trials 2 is a really great looking game. The physics are very authentic for the most part, but like all physics engines, it does go a bit bonkers now and then. It's usually funny rather than frustrating when stuff like that happens, even if it does ruin your score. Although it's a lot of fun, its singular focus on so simple, albeit brilliant, a gameplay model means that unless you're a highly competitive person who wants to compete in the online leaderboards, Trials 2 will probably mostly end up being a gap filler game after a few days of solid play, the kind of game you only play when you've nothing to do. But the great thing about Trials 2 is that whether that gap is 5 minutes or 2 hours long, the game will always rise to the occasion. It's a fun change of pace for most gamers that will especially appeal to fans of platformers, and it's definitely worth checking out.